Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Sandman. I am the Assistant Field Coordinator for Native American Producer Success Projects, and we invite you to our weeds identification webinar. This afternoon, our weed identification webinar will be presented by Carole Palmer from COPE program. She is the food systems specialist. At this time, I will give the floor over to Carole. Go ahead, Carole.
Yat She Carole Palmer Yinishe, Irish Nishli, Swedish Bashashin, Scottish Dashiche, Peshpichai Dashanale. So all my clans are not Navajo, but maybe I have some relatives out there. Weeds is our topic today. So of course, this is an ongoing dilemma, and it really comes down to scale. So mostly what I'm going to be talking about is really the smaller scale gardening activities. Because when you're talking about big fields and such, you really have to use different strategies. But basically, that's a bottom line question. Do we weed? Do we not weed? What do we let nature do? What do we do ourselves? So how do we want to define a weed? The most basic definition is a plant out of place. For example, where I live now, I am fortunate to have 2 apricot trees, which is really cool, except one of them is only a few feet away from the house, which is not ideal. So technically that apricot tree is a weed because it's not in a good place. So, but really when we think of weeds, we think of plants that have certain characteristics that will make them weedy. And so lots of seeds, tumbleweeds have lots of seeds. And they may have other things where they'll hook onto your clothing, your socks, your animals. So Velcro was invented because of parts of a plant that were sticky. So we can get inspired by nature, but we can also get irritated by it when it comes to weeds. The other thing we do not appreciate about weeds is that when they get established, they can crowd out the other plants that we were planning to have there. So that's what makes them a weed, is when we get aggravated. And then they can grow just about anywhere. And that's the thing, plants are survivors. And so I put this in, the COPE office is that I know it's on an angle, so a little tipsy here, but I was trying to get the storefronts in there, but the COPE office is that orangey looking thing more towards the end of the row of the photos there. But they've been doing construction on Cole Street where our office is located. And I've got an arrow pointing to, you can see some growth happening. And this is below the sidewalk area and it's all been covered up now, but that's actually a crabapple tree left over because there used to be trees along the street there and they pulled those out, but there was still enough roots in the ground that tree is sprouting. So in this situation, it's a weed. I know a lot of people that would love to have this tree as a tree, but that's, again, it's not where it's supposed to be, but it wants to live, it wants to survive. It got disturbed, it said, hey, I need to grow. And so tends to be how we have weeds. It's really perspective and definition can vary. So in the agricultural frame of things, we have to do a little comparison and contrast. So really in nature, there's no such thing as a weed because they all have a purpose. And so what we think of as a weed is serving some good. A lot of times they'll sprout where nothing is growing, and that can be an indicator of soil conditions. It can help with erosion control, even though they're not the plants we want to have there. Several of the native or non-native tree species that we have that are aggravating to us came over because they were intended to be used for erosion control. So, and then as far as products of agriculture, they tend to grow where soil has been disturbed. So all of these practices that we promote regarding no-till and things like that, this is one reason to consider that option, because when you till the soil, you disturb a lot of seeds, a lot of weed seeds that have blown in, some that have been buried and they can't sprout without light. So the other thing about weeds is that they will co-evolve with crops. And so that's why weeds become a problem in agriculture, especially the large scale industrial agriculture, because they've adapted, and there is a lot of money. It's a whole other industry now with Roundup ready crop varieties that can be planted, that there's already some GMO altering of the seeds so that when the plant sprouts, then the big machines can come in with the Roundup and the crop won't die, but the weed will. That's the theory. It's not working out that well, but we keep trying. The human species is still evolving. So had to start off with this one as Michael's favorite plant. Weeds are often non-native plants, and one of the ones that travels around a lot is commonly known as goat heads, also bull heads. But these plants have a mechanism that allows them to keep on moving down the road, literally. So people, birds, animals will all help spread the non-native weeds around. But they're easy to identify. This particular one, it doesn't matter where I am. If I'm in Gallup or Farmington or Albuquerque, if I see a little one of these growing, I'm likely to bend over and pluck it out, because they are annoying and they really hurt when you step on them, and they'll really stick in your shoes and your tires. So they are, however, a medicinal plant. So again, these plants that we consider weeds that have come from other places, where they're native to, they often have other uses. So this is actually a traditional Chinese medicine. One of the common names for this plant is horny goatweed, and it is used to improve male virility, shall we say. So again, you never know. If it's not native here, that doesn't mean that it wasn't useful somewhere else. So there was actually a professor that was trying to organize a collection of these so that they could become a cash crop instead of a weed. So again, matter of perspective. One of the big ways that weeds can come through is through animal feed. So hay is not regulated in this area, and so anything can be traveling in, and that's one way to help reduce the spread. But I think pretty much now everything that's here we're already stuck with, and we have to figure out how to deal with it. But that's one way that weeds can come in. So what we need to consider here is the idea of native versus non-native. What are the weeds displacing? So anything native was adapted here. Natural forces keep them in balance and harmony mostly. So why I'm mentioning this is that the non-native plants that originated in other parts of the world, they don't have the natural enemies here. And so that's how they can really get their foothold in. And that is why one of the options that's being explored for weed control, and people will be especially familiar with this when it comes to the tamarisk issues, salt cedar, is bringing in one of the natural balances. So the tamarisk leaf beetle has been brought in, and there has been some success with this little beetle traveling around and reproducing and killing off tamarisk trees. It's not 100%, but there's been some action. Similarly with field bindweed, there's a bindweed mite, and there have been efforts to use that little mite, import the little mite and let it do the work that it does in its native territory of keeping that weed in more of a balanced situation. So it's one of those things that is has its pros and cons. And for Navajo, biological controls are not really supported, and it's something that people are still evaluating, because there comes a day when maybe they run out of something to eat, and then what? And we don't really have good answers for that. So Navajo Nation covers a lot of territory, including Arizona. And one of the most interesting things to me is how the morning glory is technically viewed in Arizona, at least legally. So it used to be that actually growing morning glories, and that's this flower here, the blue flower, was illegal. And it's recently changed. They've revised the list as of last year. I think it was January 4th, 2020 is the date I saw. But there are at least 11 native species of morning glory in Arizona. And then there are the commercial species that were still for sale. And technically, though, illegal because of another plant that we all love to hate. And that's this one, which is the field bindweed. So ironically, it's as much political as anything else. Bindweed is a pain. It wraps around things and all that. And so it was really a lobbying effort by the farmers and ranchers in Southern Arizona that made this plant illegal. And for the most part, it's a status that's not really enforceable, but I have been told of an incident in Southern Arizona. I'm not sure if it was in Bisbee or Sierra Vista, but somebody's farm was featured in an article in the local newspaper, and they had included a picture of this beautiful archway that was covered in morning glories. And I'm told that the family was actually contacted by the Arizona Department of Agriculture about their morning glories. So I guess it's on a slow day, it can still happen, but this is changing. But in general, this is considered a noxious weed, and because of its longevity, the roots go down deep, the seeds can live for years and years and years. There's lots of statistics out there, but it's a very pretty little plant. So it's one of those things, though, that can grow from almost any part. It will set seeds. You can cut those vines apart, and individual sections of the vine will grow. It just wants to live. And so that's where the bindweed mite in New Mexico has had some success, but you really have to be on it and know what you're doing and get it. It's all about the timing. So this is another one that the smaller picture there is of the plant that we are familiar with. And I'm never quite sure how to pronounce it. So I tend to call it kochia or kochia. It's spelled Kochia. So I'm not sure exactly how it got here, but this other plant in the picture, that's the commercial version or the landscaping version. Like, it's supposed to be a pretty landscape plant. And so there's this other kochia that is related that turns these bright colors and that's not a photoshopped photo. That's an actual photo of these plants that are cousins to the kochia that we live with. And yeah, if it looked like that, I might think it was pretty too, but our version doesn't look like that. And so I'm hoping this quote here from Ralph Waldo Emerson says, what is a weed? A plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. There must be some other virtues to kochia, and I just don't know what it is. At least it's not thorny like, some of the other ones. But I find it really ironic that's one of the reasons why we have this plant. That if it looked like this, we might not be so sour about it. Anyway, another thing I just wanted to bring up as we're talking about weed identification and plant identification, the average person, there's a few studies out there, can identify over 1,000 corporate logos very easily, but less than 10 plants and animals native to the region. So this photo here shows what is known as the Hopi red dye amaranth, but it's growing with the native amaranth, one of the native amaranths. And so that's something that, again, is it a weed? Is it a crop? Amaranth seeds are available for sale in the stores. I think you can even get them at Walmart. So this is another photo of the amaranth. This is Palmer's amaranth. So since Palmer is my last name, I tend to include pictures that are There was a botanist that, or an explorer anyway, some guy was running around Arizona in the 1800s, and he named a bunch of stuff. So, or it got named after him. But this is the Palmer's amaranth, but it's also known as wild spinach, and it's an edible food. It can be a weed. It can be a weed in your garden. So then you decide, well, it's already growing on its own without a lot of my help, and it's edible. So maybe it's not a weed after all, and maybe I take advantage of this when all the lettuce dies and goes to seed, I can still eat this. So again, it's perspective. Do we decide it's a weed or not a weed? So here's a logo for you. How long did it take you to think of what that logo is for? Do I have to even tell you what it's for? I think not. I think we all know. So how do we find out what these weeds are? There are a bunch of them. And as I was, after I agreed to do this, I realized, oh my gosh, I could do a 5-hour presentation on weeds if we were going to go through and try to identify all of them. So instead, what I thought would be more useful is to look at some of the resources that we have available to us now to track down what things are. And one of the real handy ones, I think, is this website. It's Northern Arizona Invasive Plants, and it was put together by, I believe, some master gardeners connected with the Flagstaff Coconino County Master Gardener Program, and they put this together. And so they even have fact sheets and such. And so I use cheatgrass here because one of the other challenges we have with these weeds, and especially if you're in a larger range situation, is cheatgrass is something that in the early stages, it is somewhat desirable because the animals will use it. They'll eat it as forage when it's small, and it's one of the first things that will be sprouting in the spring. But then it dries, and then it's a fire hazard because it can really carry a fire quickly. So these are the kinds of things that that we always need to consider. But with this website, if you're trying to track things down, there are a lot of different weeds, or I have quote unquote weeds on this site, listed by common name. So it's something that it's not a huge list, but this is really, these are kind of hitting the highlights of what most people are going to find in your gardens, in your fields. It's a lot of the heavy hitters, and at different times of year. So in the first column there, a few down, the burr buttercup, that's one that comes out as a really tiny little thing, and it comes up in the spring, and then it dries up by May. It's drying up, and but it's small and it's thorny. Once it dries, it's not so bad when it's still green. But if you even just want to, you have something you can identify, all of these on the website, all of these have hyperlinks, and you can just click on it and see the pictures and decide if that's what you have. So I think this is a really useful site in terms of a short list, the most common usual suspects that you're going to see, and then something that is really clear and easy to look at. So, however, some of these I don't consider weeds as much because they have other uses. So again, it's all a matter of perspective and what does a weed mean to you? So this is one example. This is one you find usually it's a cooler weather, just like with everything else. We have cool season weeds and warm season weeds. So this is a cool season weed. The fillery, stork's bill is another name, a lot of different common names. So again, with weeds, if you really want to get into the weeds with weeds, sorry about that, it's helpful to know their Latin names because common names can get confusing for things. But this one is actually an edible plant. If you dig it up, it smells kind of like a carrot, and the roots can be eaten. They're usually tiny around here. They're not that big. You'd have to collect a lot of them to make a meal, but they are edible. And so again, starvation food, if you were out somewhere and didn't have anything to eat, you could try this, and it can be eaten raw. The leaves are a little fuzzy, but technically you could eat those too, and the flowers. But the root is the one, and it's kind of like a parsnip, which is really like a white carrot looking thing. But it tends to be annoying when it dries out because it does get little seeds that can kind of drill into your into your socks, into your gloves, into your shirt. That they just have this little pointy end that can be aggravating. But again, so useful, not useful. Anything with a taproot does have some benefit when you have heavy clay soils or issues with soil, because the taproot will help break up some of that clay and make it easier for other things to grow. So again, there's some trade-offs sometimes with these weeds. Okay, your logo quiz again. I think it took you another less than a second to think of what the name of this corporation is. So how long did it take you to know the name of Fillory? You probably didn't know that one yet. This is another one that is really edible. Coming up now, it tends to be a warm season weed. And it's known in the Hispanic cultures as verdolagas. It's purslane is how we know it as its common name, portulaca. And you can see how it's kind of succulent. It looks juicy. It has a lemony flavor. Some people don't care for it, but I like lemon. So I find it very good. I've cooked it up before. And so this is a weed that I don't necessarily weed out of my garden. I like to let it grow, because if I felt like eating it, I could eat it. So it's sort of an alternative. Again, if your other crops die, you still have some food. And it gets a pretty little yellow flower usually. There are some commercial varieties you can buy now where they've bred them for bigger leaves and then different colors of flowers. And those are probably still edible as well, but this is the basic form of that plant. So usually when you see that one, then later in the season, as the rains are coming now, and in theory, we might get some rain today, we'll see. But this is a bug that is really found in this area in certain regions, and it's a water bearer bug. Common names for it also is football bug, but it's something that has stories around it and such, and it really loves this plant. So you could also leave that plant just as a sort of a deterrent, because once this bug finishes off these plants, it'll go to your other plants. So, and you're not supposed to kill it. So it's something to consider, that sometimes you have to leave the weeds as trap crops or as alternatives for the bugs that you don't want eating your main crops. Logo. I think we all know who the Colonel is there. And that's my dog modeling next to another weed that is edible, prickly lettuce. And this is something that, again, not something that I would eat unless I needed to, only because it is prickly. There are little thorns on the sides of the leaves and such. But it has a pretty little flower. And again, it can be something that is sort of your backup food, your emergency rations. We're in a drought. And so if this thing is growing well and is green, then and this one it's next to my garden raised bed, so it gets extra water. So it's happier than it should be, but it's an edible weed. So I tend to let it go and let it go to seed, because if I needed to eat it, I could still eat it. Logo, Sharon should know this one. Another resource. So there was a project that was started a few years ago, and now it's available through the NMSU website. There are a few little printed copies of this, but the website is the best place to track it down, because through the website, you can listen to the Navajo names. So Selected Plants of Navajo Rangelands is a resource that it was meant to be an interactive app originally, and that proved a little too complicated for the budget, but it's a great resource, has a lot of different plants, weeds and native plants and non-native plants. 378 pages, I think, total, including the index. So lots and lots and lots of information there. And you can go and print it out in an 8.5 by 11 format if you so choose, if you wanted to select individual pages for that. But it's also downloadable. And you can see by the size, if you look down there, the The downloadable PDF is 107.8 megabytes, which is a pretty darn big file. So that's something that, again, you'd want to have. You wouldn't necessarily just toss it onto your phone, but maybe you would. And then another one that I'm really happy that is still included on the website is this original Navajo Nation Range Management Handbook, because it really has good illustrations of the grasses and such, and I really lobbied for it to not just be tossed aside. So I'm glad that it's included here as a reference, because that's the thing that it's just really handy to know if you are doing range management, or even on a small scale, if you just want to identify things. This is a really great resource. And this one's in black and white. It's a lot smaller, but again, knowing what a weed is also knowing what a weed isn't, and just learning your plant relatives and who they are out there in your area. You can also do a search on the website, so that's really handy. The more information you have, the more likely you are to come up with something that's going to make sense. If you only know flower color, you might get too many choices, but it's a really good resource, and it's something that I think is, especially if you have a computer available, it'll be a lot easier to try to play around with it and navigate the possibilities of the site. But I think you can even do it on other devices and just see, tablets and such. All right, logo time. Nobody knows this one, right? For larger scale activities, BIA did do they hired a consulting firm and they did an extensive study. This is a PDF document that can be downloaded, and it's 122 pages. Not really any photos in the document, but it has a lot of information as far as the actual plants that can be found, where they're found, how they, what time of year they grow, how they might interact with the landscape. And also a lot of information on potential herbicides and biochemical treatments, and the idea of using the bugs or the other kinds of treatments to address it, because this is something that is challenging that I didn't mention yet, is that we do tend to have a lot of wind. I don't know that anybody's noticed that, but that is a really great way to disperse weed seeds. And when weeds have thousands and thousands of seeds and the wind comes along and helps them travel around, for the overall Navajo Nation landscape, you can find some pretty crazy weed situations. And once they take hold, they can really get established, and then it's difficult to try to change that. So where's the balance? Again, in some situations, these weeds may be providing a beneficial service. They may be assisting with erosion control. They're still providing food for wildlife and for animals to a certain degree. One of the challenges is that some of these weeds are toxic to livestock. And so if nothing else is growing and the livestock only have this or that particular weed to eat, that's when we run into trouble with animals dying or getting sick or having deformities in their offspring. There's just a lot of things that can happen if the animals eat a plant at a certain stage. So this is where it's a real concern, and it's a little overwhelming sometimes to think about. So a lot of people are working on trying to find ways to address it. So any small thing that we can do is gonna help. It's easy to get overwhelmed, but I think we just need to find out what are the strategies where we can work together and improve the situation, and not just toss our hands up in the air and say, well, it's somebody else's problem, because the next generations are not going to be real thrilled with that approach. So back to the small scale, there are strategies, of course, for a weed-free garden. And so first thing is identifying, what do you think is a weed? And then when you have decided, well, this is a weed, that's a weed, because I have parsley that reseeds. So it reseeds wherever it wants to, and that can be a weed if I don't want it where it is. So as soon as you've decided something is a weed and you don't want it there, then pull it while it's still small, while it doesn't have much of a root, while it hasn't really taken hold and established itself, because that's the easiest time, of course. It's just going to be tiny. Another way that weeds can come in is by plants you buy in the store, at Walmart, at Home Depot, at a nursery. Sometimes they come with weeds, and the weeds might be small and you might not realize it. But there's a plant that grows, it looks like a shamrock. It has the 3 little leaves, oxalis, and it can also be edible. It has a lemony flavor a lot of the time, but it's a very common greenhouse weed. And I ended up with this weed from some herb plants that I got, and I didn't realize it. And I thought, oh, that's cute. It's small. Oh my gosh. It just took off, and it did. It outcompeted my other plants. And I had to just get on it and get rid of it because it was really wanting to grow, and lots of tiny little seeds. So always look at the plants that you get and watch and check the dirt and such, because that little innocent plant might not be something that you want. We tend to promote gardening in raised beds and containers because you can do that more easily without having to worry as much about soil testing, or in my situation where I'm living now, I dig down 2 inches and there's rock everywhere. So it makes it a real challenge to try to plant things in the ground. But the advantage of a raised bed or a container garden is that it also brings the weeds up closer to you. So if you do have to pull weeds, if they blow in from other places, or if they've come in on a transplant, it's a lot easier to pick them out because they're just a little bit higher. You don't have to crawl around on the ground or get your hoe out. So, and same thing with the container gardens as well. Cover crops is something that I believe NAPS has had presentations on in the past. And that's something that is a strategy to reduce weeds, because weeds are going to grow where there's a space. And so if you find ways to not give them a space to grow or light, then they can't get started. So cover crops is another strategy that can be used. It can be used to rebuild your soil, and also to then, as the healthier your soil, the better the weeds, or the fewer the weeds. So never let weeds go to seed. So again, if it's not something that you want, then you need to get it when it's small. And it's because any particular weed, depending on what statistic you look at, just can have thousands of seeds, especially the larger that it grows, the more seeds it's going to have. So if they don't go to seed in the first place, then there you go. No weeds. The only ones that'll come up are the ones that you didn't catch the first time around. Mulch, 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 mulch. We always talk about that. And that's something where, I don't know if you recognize, this is a picture of my little funky container. There's a tomato and a basil plant in that container on the right-hand side there. And what I'm experimenting with this year, I've been meaning to do it in the past and never really did it formally, but that's wool, scrap wool from a friend of mine whose family did their shearing, and so gave me the scrap wool that is perfect, because wool has nutrients, and it has, a lot of times the scraps have some of the manure on them and such. And so there's more to wool than one would think. But the great thing, what I've been discovering about experimenting with this right now, is that not only is it providing a good mulch, the water will go through it, and it holds the water beneath. And I've got a couple of seeds. I planted some seeds in there as well. And then I put the mulch on. I thought, oh shoot, I should have had a transplant instead. But the seeds are growing up through the wool also. So I'm just really interested to see how this goes. But some people might not like the look of it. And I did have an issue. These containers are tall enough that they're easy for me to reach, but they're not tall enough that my dog can't get in them. The one that was in the picture a few slides ago. And she originally decided that that was kind of cool that I put that wool out there, and it must have been a gift for her. So she pulled some of it out, but we sort of reached an agreement because I kept putting it back, and she's bored with it now, so she hasn't tried to pull it out. And maybe some of the interesting smells are gone since we have had a little teeny tiny bit of rain, and I've watered from the top. So, but this pot also has, it's a self-watering container. So the idea of growing healthy soil and smart watering are also important, because one of the ways that weed seeds can travel is through water. So people up in Shiprock have the advantage of having the rivers and the ditches and such, but a lot of weeds grow along the ditches, and a lot of weed seeds come through that with that water. So it's something that I know that there have been presentations on drip irrigation systems and other approaches that are more targeted. And that's one way to keep your weeds down. If you're not just mass watering everything, they can still grow, but they won't be as big, and they'll be easier to manage. And again, really the foundation of everything is healthy soil. And I think we all tend to try to reinforce that as much as possible. The healthier your soil is, then the fewer problems you're going to have, because all of those factors are going to work together to keep a good situation. And you're just not going to get as many weeds, because weeds thrive in adverse conditions, in bad soil. So if your soil is good, it's going to be too nice for the weeds. So one of the things that was mentioned is just that idea of a denser planting. I think we can get caught up in, and this really kind of goes down to your personal philosophy as well, of how you like to do things. Some people like very neat and tidy rows, and other people are going to be more let it look like nature, and some people are in between. And so, but the closer you can plant things and still allow for air circulation. If you look at the Three Sisters idea, where the squash is providing that mulch on the ground that shades out the light where weed seeds can grow. So you're not going to see a lot of weeds growing underneath squash leaves, because they just don't have the sunlight to get started. So it just depends on the timing again, if they were already starting to get established, or if it was too late for them to get established. But if you plant things closer together in a good way, then you're going to minimize the possibility for weeds to come in. Or if they do come in, it's going to be easier to see them, because they're going to be a real contrast with your other plants. And you're going to say, okay, that can go away. So just to wrap things up here, I just wanted to bring to mind, we tend to get caught up in the work aspect of gardening and farming, and it is a lot of work. It can be a lot of work. If weeds are taking hold, they can be a real pain to try to get them under control, and it can be very exhausting. But we're doing this because we love it, because we want to grow food for our families, for our communities. And so we need to do it with a good heart and a good attitude, as frustrated as we might get some days. So I just included this as a checklist that's a little more light and a different perspective. So laugh at aphids, grow what you love, eat the best berries, listen to the birds, play in the dirt, nap in the shade, watch the night stars. So Empress of Dirt is up in Canada, so she has less night stars and more berries than we do, but she has some fun little graphics sometimes. But I really thought that this was a good checklist to keep in mind, to keep us balanced and not just focused on the work aspect, but also on what do we enjoy about it, and what can we learn. There are always so many things to learn. So that is it for my weed ID for today. As I said, I could have gone on for 5 hours, but I tried to keep this one short because there are good references and good resources, and everybody's garden and farm and home site is going to have a slightly different assortment of weeds. And right now, it's been so dry that in some ways, we're not going to really know what's there until it rains again because it's been too dry for a lot of things to sprout. So we may get a feast or famine situation to where right now there's not too much out there. And then when we do get the rains, we might suddenly be faced with a whole lot of weeds to get rid of. But again, when they're small, they're easier. So we'll want to make sure that we're able to get on it before they get too large. So are there any questions or comments or other thoughts?
Okay, if you guys got some questions, go ahead and raise your hand. I can unmute you. If you don't want to talk, just send it in the chat box. But I had a question for you, Carole. I know you were showing you had a picture of what is it, the prickly weed?
Oh, the prickly lettuce. Yes.
How do you, how do you prepare that, you know?
Well, because it's got the little spines on it, of course, it's better to pick it when it's a little bit smaller and not too tough, because it can get, as it gets larger, then leaves get tough. But that's something that I would be cooking, not eating raw, if I were able to, unless I were desperate and out in the middle of nowhere with nothing to eat, and then I would eat it raw. But just to pick it and eat it, because once you cook something, then that really, it kind of eliminates the spines and softens them up. So, I mean, and technically if the leaves are larger, you could trim them off, but I cook it. It's sort of like spinach that way.
Right. Okay. All right. Does anyone have any other questions? Any last things? But I enjoyed your presentation, Carole. I know it's pretty tough identifying weeds. It seems like now that we're in a drought, we're getting different kind of weeds showing up. So are you, if we have trouble identifying, are you able to, if we could send you a picture of a weed, are you able to respond?
Sometimes
help producers.
Yeah, sometimes
Okay.
it depends, and it depends on the photo. I have people sending me pictures of things a lot. Actually, it's kind of funny, and sometimes they're really easy, and sometimes it's something that I'm familiar with, but I don't quite remember, so I have to do a little research. Like, what was that one again? Because I got a picture a couple weeks ago that somebody had taken up in Colorado. So it's not something we see on Navajo much because it likes the higher elevations and the moisture that's up there. But we could see it. It probably is up in the Chuscas somewhere. That skunk cabbage, it's got a lot of other, that's not really what it is, but yeah, so, and there are, like, NMSU has, I think, also a weed ID site. I know the University of Arizona has had one in the past. Sometimes these databases get moved around, and sometimes, again, you might get something really goofy, not really what your plant is. So, but I can certainly give it a shot the first time around, and if I can't identify it, then I can refer people to somebody who can.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Carole. Thank you again, Carole, for your presentation. I did learn a few things, and I'm sure our producers out there did as well. And so thank you guys for joining us today. Please, if you guys are able to, when you guys exit the webinar, there is going to be a survey that pops up. Fill that out for us, and we will see you next week. Hopefully we are going to have our natural resource fair webinars featuring FSA, NRCS, and sharing their programs. So please join us next week. Information will be posted on our Facebook page. Yes.
I just wanted to say one more thing. I just wanted to thank you again for having me today. I don't really know that I said that in the beginning. And I hope that the people that are seeing these different webinars recognize what a really great resource these are and the work that goes into them on the part of Jesse, Sharon, and Jana to even just try to figure out, well, what are people interested in? What is the information that is going to be useful? And so I appreciate all that you guys have been doing, trying to have the technology work for us all to still be able to get information out when we can't be in person. So yeah, thank you for that.
Right. Thank you, Carole. It is a lot of hard work, but we will get through this pandemic and hopefully back in the field sooner than later anyway. But thanks again, everyone. We do have a YouTube channel. If you missed a couple webinars, we have been doing webinars, 4 to 5 webinars a month, and so you can go on our channel and look at what we got on there. And then also, if you would like to be part of our monthly newsletter, email us, and on the survey it is there is a slot for you to include your email. With that said, thank you again, and we will see you all next week. Please stay safe out there. All right, everyone.
Thank you. Native American Producer Success Projects is a collaborative effort between Dene Inc., a nonprofit organization, New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service, and Dene College Land Grant Office. The project is funded by USDA's Office of Partnership and Public Engagement, Outreach and Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers Program. The goals of NAP's project is to increase the profitability and long-term sustainability of Navajo farmers and ranchers. To achieve this goal, activities in 4 key areas are being undertaken to improve Navajo farm and ranch operations, increase Navajo farmer rancher knowledge of and access to available programs and technical assistance provided by the United States Department of Agriculture, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Navajo Nation, the New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service, the Dene College Land Grant Office, and others. To strengthen the organizational capacity of the Navajo Farmer and Rancher Congress to address the current and future needs of Navajo farmers and ranchers, and to facilitate Navajo farmer rancher use of USDA's NRCS, FSA, and RMA programs.